The Great Ruby Robbery, a detective story by Grant Allen. Persis Remnant was an American heiress. As she just remarked, this was a commonplace profession for a young woman nowadays, for almost everybody of late years has been an American and an heiress. A poor Californian, indeed, would be a charming novelty in London society. But London society, so far, has had to go without one. Persis Remnant was on her way back from Wilcox's ball. She was stopping, of course, with Sir Everard and Lady McClure at their house in Hampstead. I say, of course, advisedly, because if you go or I go to see New York, we have to put up at our own expense $5 a day without wine or extras at the Windsor or at Fifth Avenue. But when a pretty American comes to London, and every American girl is an ex officio pretty, in Europe at least, I suppose they keep their ugly ones at home for domestic consumption. She is invariably the guest either of a dowager duchess or of a royal academician like Sir Edward, of the first distinction. Yankees visit Europe, in fact, to see, among other things, our art, our old nobility, and by a dint of native persistence they get into places that you and I could never succeed in penetrating, unless we devoted all the energies of a long and blameless life to securing an invitation. Persis hadn't been to the Wilcoxes with Lady McClure, however. The McClures were too really great to know such people of the Wilcoxes, who were something tremendous in the city but didn't buy pictures. And academians, don't care to cultivate city people unless they're customers. Patrons, as the academians more usually call them, but I prefer the simple business word myself, as being a deal less patronizing. So, Persis had accepted the invitation from Mrs. Duncan Harrison, of the wife of the well-known member of the Hackness Division of Elmshire, to take a seat in her carriage to and from the Wilcoxes. Mrs. Harrison knew the habits and manners of American heiresses too well to offer a chaperone Persis, and indeed, Persis was a free-born American citizen, quite well as being able to take care of herself, the wide world over, as any three ordinary Englishwomen. Now, Mrs. Harrison had a brother, an Irish baronet, Sir Justin O'Byrne, late of the 8th Hussars, who had been with them to the Wilcoxes, and who accompanied them to the Hampstead on the back seat of the carriage. Sir Justin was one of those charming, ineffective, elusive Irishmen whom everybody likes and everybody disapproves of. He had been everywhere and had done everything except to earn an honest livelihood. The total absence of rents during the 60s and 70s had never prevented his father, Sir Terence O'Byrne, who sat so long in Common Era in the unreformed Parliament, from sending his son Justin in states to Eton, and afterwards to a fashionable college at Oxford. He gave me the education of a gentleman, Sir Justin was wont regretfully to observe, but he omitted to give me also the income to keep up with it. Nevertheless, society felt O'Byrne was the sort of man who must be kept afloat somehow, and it kept him afloat accordingly in those mysterious ways that only society understands, and that you and I, who are not society, could never get to the bottom of if we tried for a century. Sir Justin himself had swayed Parliament, too, where he had sat for a while at the Great Parnell without for a moment forfeiting society's regard, even for those earlier days when it was held as a prime article of faith by the world that no gentleman could possibly call himself a home ruler. 'Twas only one of O'Byrne's wild Irish tricks, society said, complacently, with that singular indulgence it always extends to its special favourites, and which is, in fact, the correlative of that unsparing cruelty that it shows in turn to those who happen to offend against its unwritten precepts. If Sir Justin had blown up a czar, or two in fits of political exuberance, society would have only regarded that escapade as one of O'Byrne's eccentricities. He had also held a commission for a while in a cavalry regiment, which he left, it was understood, owing to a difference of opinion with a lady at the colonel. And he was now a gentleman at large in London society, supposed by those who know more about everyone than one knows about oneself, to be on the lookout for a nice girl with a little money. Sir Justin had paid Persis a great deal of attention at the particular evening. In point of fact, he had paid her a great deal of attention from the very first whenever he met her. And on the way home from the dance, he had kept his eyes fixed on Persis' face to an extent that was almost embarrassing. The pretty Californian leaned back in her place in the carriage and surveyed him languidly. She was looking her level best that night in her pale pink dress, with the famous remnant rubies and a cascade of red light setting off that showy neck of hers. 'Twas the neck of a painter. Sir Justin let his eyes fall regrettably more than once upon the glittering rubies. He liked and admired Persis, quite immensely. Your society man who has been through 7 or 8 London seasons could hardly be expected to not quite so far as falling in love with any woman. His habit is rather to look about him critically among all the nice girls trotted out by their mammas for his lordly inspection, and to reflect with a faint smile that this, that, or the other one might perhaps really suit him, if it were not for, and here comes the inevitable but, of all human commendation. Still, Sir Justin admitted with a sigh to himself that he liked Persis ever so much. She was so fresh and original, and she talked so cleverly. As for Persis, she would have given her eyes, like every other American girl, to be made my lady, and she had seen no man yet with an auxiliary title in his gift whom she liked half so well as this delightful, wild Irishman. At the McClure's door, the carriage stopped. Sir Justin jumped out and gave his hand to Persis. You know how the house well, of course. Sir Everard McClure's is one of those large artistic mansions in red brick and old oak, on the top of a hill, and stands a little way back from the road, discreetly retired with a big wooden porch, very convenient for leave-taking. Sir Justin ran up the steps with Persis to ring the bell for her. He had tried too much to be an impressionable Irish blood in his veins to leave that pleasant task to his sister's footman. But he didn't ring it at once, at the risk of keeping Mrs. Harrison waiting outside for nothing. He stopped and talked a minute or so with the pretty American. "You look right charming tonight, Miss Ramnett," he said, as she threw back her light opera wrap for a moment in that porch and displayed a single flash of that showy necklace with the famous rubies. "Those stones become you, too." Persis looked at him and smiled. "You think so?" she said, with a little tremulous, for even your American heiress, after all, is a woman. "Well, I'm glad you do, but it's not goodbye tonight, Miss Sir Justin, for I just go next week to Paris." Even in the gloom of the porch, just lighted by the artistic red and blue lanterns of the wrought iron, she could see a shade of disappointment quickly pass over his handsome face as he answered, with a little gulp. "Oh, you don't mean that? Oh, Miss Ramnett, I'm so sorry." And then he paused and drew back. "And yet, after all," he continued, "perhaps..." And there he checked himself. Persis looked up at him hastily. "Yet, after all, what?" she asked, in evident interest. The young man drew an almost inaudible sigh. "Yet, after all, nothing," he answered evasively. "That might do for an Englishwoman," Persis put in, for American frankness. "But it won't do for me. You must tell me what you meant by it." For she reflected sagely that the happiness of 2 lives might depend on those 2 minutes, and how foolish to throw away the chance of a man you really like, with my ladyship to boot, all of the sake for pure convention. Sir Justin leaned against the woodwork of that retiring porch. She was a beautiful girl. She had hot Irish blood. Well, yes, just for once he could say the plain truth to her. "Miss Remnant," leaning forward, he began, and bringing his face close to hers. "Miss Remnant, Persis, shall I tell you the reason why? Because I like you so much, I almost think that I love you." Persis felt the blood quiver in her tingling cheeks. How handsome he was, and a baronet. "And yet you're not altogether sorry," she said reproachfully, "that I'm going to Paris?" "No, not altogether sorry," he answered, sticking to it. "And I'll tell you why, too, Miss Remnant. I like you very much, and I think you like me. For a week or two I've been saying to myself, I really must ask her to marry me. The temptation's been so strong I could hardly resist it." "And why do you want to resist it?" Persis asked tremulously. Sir Justin hesitated a second. Then with a perfect natural and instinctive movement, though only a gentleman would have ventured to make it, he lifted his hand and just touched with the tips of his fingers the ruby pendant on her necklet. "This is why," he answered simply, with the manly frankness. "Persis, you're so rich, I never dared ask you." "Perhaps you don't know what my answer would be," Persis murmured very low, just to preserve her own dignity. "Oh, yes, I think I do," the young man replied, gazing deeply into her dark eyes. "It isn't that. If it were only that, I wouldn't mind so much. But I think you'd take me." There was the moisture in her eye. He went on more boldly. "I know you'd take me, Persis, and that's why I don't ask you. You're a great deal too rich, and these make it impossible." "Sir Justin," Persis answered, removing his hand gently, but the moisture growing thicker, for she really liked him. "It's most unkind of you to say so. Either you oughtn't to have told me at all, or else, if you did—" She stopped short. Womanly shame overcame her. The man leaned forward and spoke earnestly. "Oh, don't say that," he cried from his heart. "I couldn't bear to offend you, but I couldn't bear either to let you go away, well, without having ever told you. In that case you might have thought I didn't care for you at all, and I was only flirting with you. But, Persis, I've cared a great deal for you, a great, great deal, and had hard work many times to prevent myself from asking you. And I'll tell you the plain reason why I haven't asked you. I'm a man about town. It's not much good, I'm afraid, for anybody or anything, and everybody says I'm on the lookout for an heiress, which happens not to be true. And if I married you, everybody'd say, there, I told you so. And now I wouldn't mind that for myself. I'm a man, and I can snap my fingers at them. But I'd mind it for you, Persis, for I'm enough in love with you to be very, very jealous indeed for your honor. I couldn't bear to think of people would say, there's that pretty American girl, Persis Remnant, that was, you know. She's thrown herself away upon that good-for-nothing Irishman, Justin O'Byrne, a regular fortune hunter, who's married her for her money. So for your sake, Persis, I'd rather not ask you. I'd rather leave you for some better man to marry." "But I wouldn't," Persis cried aloud. "Oh, Sir Justin, you must believe me. You must remember." At that precise point, Mrs. Harrison put out her head out of the carriage window and called out rather loudly, Why, Justin, what's keeping you? The horses will catch their death of cold, and they were clipped this morning. Come back here at once, my dear boy. Besides, you know, la conveniences. All right, Nora, her brother answered. I won't be a minute, but we can't get them to answer this precious bell. I believe it don't ring, but I'll try again anyhow. And half forgetting that his own words weren't strictly true, for he hadn't yet tried, he pressed the knob with a vengeance. Is that your room with the light burning, Miss Narmont? He went on, in a fairly loud occasional voice, as a servant came to the door. The one on the balcony, I mean. Quite Venetian, isn't it? Reminds one of Romeo and Juliet. The most convenient for a burglary, too. Such nice low rails. Mind you take good care of the remnant rubies. I don't want to take care of them, Persis answered, wiping her dim eyes hastily with her lace handkerchief. If they make you feel as you say, Mr. Justin, I don't mind if they go. Let the burglars take them. And even as she spoke, the McClure footman, immutable, sphinx-like, opened the door for her. Welcome in, and thanks for the raid. Persis sat long in her own room that night before she began undressing. Her head was full of Sir Justin and these mysterious hints of his. At last, however, she took her rubies off and her pretty silk bodice. I don't care for them at all, she thought with a gulp. If they keep me from the love of the man I'd love to marry. It was late before she fell asleep, and when she did, her rest was troubled. She dreamt a great deal in her dreams. Sir Justin and dance music, and the rubies and the burglars were incongruously mingled. To make up for it, she slept late next morning, and Lady McClure let her sleep on, thinking she was probably wearied out with much dancing the previous evening, as though any amount of excitement could ever weary a pretty American. About 10 o'clock, she woke with a start. A vague feeling oppressed her that somebody had come in during the night and stolen her rubies. She rose hastily and went to her dressing table to look for them. The case was there all right. She opened it and looked in. Oh, prophetic soul! The rubies were gone, and the box was empty. Now, Persis had honestly thought the night before a burglar might take her rubies if he chose, and she wouldn't mind the loss of them. But that was last night, and the rubies hadn't yet been taken. This morning, somehow, things seemed quite different. It would be rough on us all, especially on politicians, if we must always be bound by what we said yesterday. Persis was an American, and no American is insensible to the charms of precious stones. 'Tis a savage taste which European immigrants seem to have inherited obliquely from their Red Indian predecessors. She rushed over to the bell and rang it with feminine violence. Lady McClure's maid answered the summons as usual. She was a clever, demure-looking girl, this maid of Lady McClure's, and when Persis cried to her wildly, "Send for the police at once and tell Sir Evelyn my jewels are stolen," she answered, "Yes, miss," with such a sombre acquiescence that Persis, who was American and therefore a bundle of nerves, turned round and stared at her for an inapprehensible mystery. No Mahatma could have been more unmoved. She seemed to quite expect those rubies would be stolen, and to take no more notice of the incident than if Persis had told her she wanted hot water. Lady McClure, indeed, greatly prided herself on the cultivated imperturbability of Bertha's. She regarded it as a fine flower of English domestic service. But Persis was American, and saw things otherwise. To her, the calm repose with which Bertha answered, "Yes, miss, certainly, miss. I'll go and tell Sir Everard," seemed nothing short of exasperating. Bertha went off with the news, closing the door quite softly, and a few minutes later Lady McClure herself appeared in the Californian's room to console her visitor under the severe domestic affliction. She found Percy sitting up in bed in her pretty French dressing jacket, pale blue with revers of the fawn color, reading a book of verses. "Why, my dear," Lady McClure exclaimed, "then you've found them again, I suppose. Bertha told us you'd lost your lovely rubies." "So I have, dear Lady McClure," Persis answered, wiping her eyes. "They're gone. They've been stolen. I forgot to lock my door when I came home last night, and the window was open. Somebody must have come in, and that's the way of this, taken them. But whenever I'm in trouble, I try a dose of Browning. He's splendid for the nerves. He's so consoling. You know, he brings one to an anchor." She breakfasted in bed. She wouldn't leave the room, she declared, until after the police arrived. After breakfast, she rose and put on her dainty Parisian morning wrap. Americans have always liked such pretty bedroom things for informal receptions, and sat out in state to await the police officer. Sir Everard himself, much disturbed that such a mishap could have happened in his house, went around in person to fetch the official. While he was gone, Lady McClure made a thorough search of the room and couldn't find a trace of the missing rubies. "Are you sure you put them in the case, dear?" she asked, for an honor of the household. And Persis answered, "Yes, quite confident, Lady McClure. I always put them there when the moment I take them off, and when I came to look for them this morning, the case was empty." "They were very valuable, I believe," said Lady McClure inquiringly. £6,000 was the figure of your money, I guess," Persis answered ruefully. "I don't know if you call that a lot of money in England, but we do in America." Then there was a moment's pause, and then Persis spoke again. "Lady McClure," she said abruptly, "do you consider that maid of yours a Christian woman?" Lady McClure was startled. That was hardly the light in which she had accustomed to regard the lower classes. "Well, I don't know about that," she said slowly. "That's a great deal, you know, dear, to assert that anybody, especially one's maid, but I would think she was honest and quite decidedly honest." "Well, that's the same thing, isn't it?" Persis answered, much relieved. "I'm glad you think that it's so much important, for I almost half afraid of her, too. She's too quiet for my taste. Somehow, so silent, you know, and inscrutable." "Oh, my dear," the hostess cried, "don't blame her for her silence. That's just what I like about her. It's exactly what I chose her for. Such a nice, noiseless girl. Moves about the room like a cat on tiptoe, knows her proper place, and never dreams of speaking unless she's spoken to." "Well, you may like them that way in Europe," Persis responded frankly. "But in America, we prefer them to be a little more human." 20 minutes later, the police officer arrived. He wasn't in uniform. The inspector, feeling at once the gravity of the case and recognizing that this was a big thing, in which there was glory to be won, and perhaps promotion, sent the detective at once, and advised that if possible nothing should be said to the household on the subject for the present, till the detective had taken a good look round the premises. That was useless, Sir Edward feared, for the landlady's maid knew, and the lady's maid would be sure to go down, all agog with the news, to the servants' hall immediately. However, they might try. No harm in trying. And the sooner the detective got round to the house, of course, the better. The detective accompanied him back, a keen-faced, close-shaven, irreproachable young man, like a vulgarized copy of Sir John Morley. He was curt and businesslike. His first question was, "Have the servants been told about this?" Lady McClure looked inquiringly across to Bertha. She herself had been sitting all the time with the bereaved Paris to console her, with Browning, under this heavy affliction. No, my lady, Bertha answered, ever calm. Valuable servant, Bertha. I didn't mention it to anybody downstairs on purpose, thinking perhaps it might be decided to search the servants' boxes. The detective pricked up his ears. He was already engaged in glancing around casually in the room. He moved about it now like a conjurer, with quiet steps and slow. He doesn't like to get on his nerves, Persis remarked approvingly in an undertone to her friend. Then she added aloud, What's your name, please, Mr. Officer? The detective was lifting a lace handkerchief on the dressing table at the side. He turned round softly. Gregory, ma'am, he answered, hardly glancing at the girl and going on with his occupation. The same as the powders, Persis interposed with a shudder. I used to take them when I was a child. I could never bear them. We're useful as remedies, the detective replied with a quiet smile, but nobody likes us. And he relapsed contentedly into his work once more, searching around the apartment. The first thing we have to do, he said with a calm air of superiority, standing now by the window with one hand in his pocket, is to satisfy ourselves whether or not there was really at all been a robbery. We must go look through the room well and see if they haven't left the rubies lying loose somewhere. Such things often happen. We're constantly called to investigate a case when it's only a matter of ladies' carelessness. At this, Persis flared up. A daughter of a great republic isn't accustomed to be doubted like a mere European woman. I'm quite sure I took them off, she said, and put them in the jewel case. Of that I'm confident. There isn't a doubt possible. Mr. Gregory redoubled his search in the likely and unlikely places. I should say that settles the matter, he answered blandly. Our experience is that whenever a lady is perfectly certain and beyond the possibility of doubt that she put a thing away safely, it's absolutely sure to turn up where she says she didn't put it. Persis answered him with never a word. Her manners had not that repose for stamps of the caisse de ver de ver. So to prevent an outbreak, she took refuge in Browning. Mr. Gregory, nothing abashed, searching the room thoroughly up and down and without the faintest regard to Persis' feelings. He was a detective, he said, and his business was first of all to unmask crime, irrespective of circumstances. Lady McClure stood by, meanwhile, with the imperturbable Bertha. Mr. Gregory investigated every hole and cranny like a man who wishes to let the world see for itself. He performs a disagreeable duty with unflinching thoroughness. When he had finished, he turned to Lady McClure. And now, you please, he said blandly, we'll proceed to investigate the servants' boxes. Lady McClure looked at her maid. Bertha, she said, go downstairs and see that none of the other servants come up, meanwhile, to their bedrooms. Lady McClure was not quite the manner-born, and she never acquired the aristocratic habits of calling women servants by their surnames only. But the detective interposed. No, he said sharply. The young woman had better stop here with Miss Radmond, strictly under her eye, till I've searched the boxes. For if I find nothing there, it may be perhaps a disagreeable duty by and by to call in a female detective to search her. It was Lady McClure's turn to flare up now. Why, this is my own maid, she said in a chilly tone, and I have every confidence in her. Very sorry for that, my lady, Gregory responded in the most official tone, but our experience teaches us that if there's a person in the case whom nobody ever dreams of suspecting, that person's the one who has likely committed the crime. Why, you'll be expecting myself next, Lady McClure cried with some disgust. Your ladyship's just the last person in the world I should think of suspecting, the detective answered with a deferential bow, which, after his previous speech, was to say, the least of the amicable. Percy began to get annoyed. She didn't like the look of that girl Bertha herself, But still, she was there at Lady McClure's guest, and she couldn't expose her hostess to the discomfort on her account. "This girl shall be searched," she put in a hot, glowing. "I don't care a cent whether I lose the wretched stones or not. Compared to human dignity, what are they worth? Not 5 minutes' consideration." "They're worth just 7 years," Mr. Gregory answered, with professional definiteness. "As to the searching, why, that's out of your hands now. This is a criminal case. I'm here to discharge a public duty." "I don't mind in the least being searched," Bertha put in obligingly, with an air of indifference. "You can search me if you like, when you've got a warrant for it." The detective looked up sharply. So also did Persis. This ready acquaintance of the liberty of the subject of criminal cases impressed her unfavorably. "Ah, we'll see about that," Mr. Gregory answered with a cool smile. "Meanwhile, Lady McClure, I'll have a look at the boxes." The search, strictly illegal, brought out nothing. Mr. Gregory returned to Persis' bedroom disconsolate. "You can leave the room," he said to Bertha, and Bertha glided out. "I've set another man outside to keep a constant eye on her," he added in explanation. By this time Persis had almost made up her mind as to who was the culprit, but she said nothing overt, for Lady McClure's sake, to the detective. As for the immovable official, he began asking questions. Some of them Persis thought almost bordering on the personal. Where had she been last night? Was she sure that she had really worn the rubies? How did she come home? Was she certain she took them off? Did the maid help her undress? Who came back with her in the carriage? And so on. All of these questions rapidly fired off with a cross-examining acuteness. Persis answered them in the direct American fashion. She was sure she had the rubies on when she came home to Hampstead, because Sir Justin O'Byrne, who came back with her in his sister's carriage, had noticed them at last thing and had told her to take care of them. At the mention of that name, the detective smiled meaningly. A meaning smile is stock in trade to a detective. "Oh, Sir Justin O'Byrne," he repeated, with quiet self-constraint. "He came back with you in the carriage, then? And did he sit in the same side with you?" Lady McClure grew indignant. That was Mr. Gregory's cue. "Really, sir," she said angrily, "if you're going to suspect a gentleman in Sir Justin's position, we shall have none of that to be safe from you." "The law," Mr. Gregory replied with an air of profound indifference, "is no respecter of persons." "But it ought to be of characters," Lady McClure cried warmly. "What's the good of having a blameless character, I should like to know, if... "It doesn't allow you to commit a robbery with impunity," the detective interposed, finishing her sentence in his own way. Well, that's true, but perfectly true. But Sir Justin's character, you see, can hardly be called blameless." "He is a gentleman," Persis cried, with the flashing eyes, turning round upon the officer, "and he's quite impeccable of such a mean and disreputable crime as you dare to suspect him of." "Oh, I see," the detective answered, like one to whom a welcome ray of light breaks suddenly through great darkness. "Sir Justin's a friend of yours. Did he come onto the porch with you?" "He did," Persis answered, flushing crimson. "And if you have the insolence to bring a charge against him—" "Calm yourself, madam," the detective replied coolly. "I did nothing of the sort at this stage of the proceedings. It is possible there may have been no robbery in the case at all. We must keep our minds open to the present, that every possible alternative. It's a delicate matter to hint at, but before we go any further, do you think, perhaps, Sir Justin may have carried the rubies away by mistake, entangled in his clothes. Say, for example, his coat sleeve. It was a loophole of escape, but Persis did jump at it. "I never had the opportunity," she answered with a flash. "And I know quite well that they were there on my neck when he left me, for the last thing he said to me was looking up at me at the very square window. 'That balcony's awfully convenient for a burglary. Mind you take good care of the remnant rubies.' And I remembered what he'd said when I took them off last night. And that's what made me so sure I really had them." "And you slept with the window open," the detective went on, still smiling to himself. "Well, here we have all the materials, to be sure, for this is a first-class mystery." For some days more, nothing further turned up of importance than the great ruby robbery. It got into the papers, of course, as everything in London does nowadays, and all the London was talking about it. Persis found herself quite famous as an American lady who had lost her jewels. People pointed her out in the park. People stared at her hard through their opera glasses at the theater. Indeed, the possession of the celebrated remnant rubies had never made her half so conspicuous in the world as the loss of them had made her. It was almost worthwhile losing them, Persis thought, to be so much made as if she were in the society of consequence. All of the world knows a young lady must be somebody when she can offer a reward for £500 for the recovery of gewgaws valued at 6,000. Sir Justin met her in the Row one day. "Then you don't go to Paris for a while yet, until you get back?" he inquired, very low. And Persis answered, blushing, "No, Sir Justin, not yet, and I'm almost glad of it." "No, you don't mean that," the young man cried with the perfect boyish ardor. "Well, I confess, Mr. Emmett, the first thing I thought myself when I read it in the Times was just the very same. Then, after all, she won't go yet to Paris." And learn the route. Paris looked at him as from her pony with American frankness. "And I," she said, quivering, "I found anchor in Browning, for what do you think I read? I learned the true rate of true man's heart above rubies. The book opened at the very place, and there I found anchor." But when Sir Justin went round to his rooms the same evening, his servant said to him, "A gentleman was inquiring for you this afternoon, sir. A clean-shaven gentleman, not very prepossessing. And it seemed to me somehow as if he were trying to pump me." Sir Justin's face was grave. He went to his bedroom at once. He knew what the man wanted, and he turned straight to his wardrobe and, looking hard at the dress coat he had worn that evening, things may cling to the sleeve, don't you know, or be entangled in a cuff, or casually get into a pocket, or someone may have put them there. For the next 10 days or so, Mr. Gregory was busy, consistently busy. Without doubt, he was the most active and energetic of detectives. He carried out so fully his own principle of suspecting everybody from Paris to Peru that at last poor Persis got fairly amazed with his web of possibilities. Nobody was safe from his cultivated and highly trained suspicion, not even Sir Everard in his studio, nor Lady McClure in her boudoir, nor the butler in his pantry, nor Sir Justin O'Byrne in his rooms in St. James. Mr. Gregory kept an open mind against everybody and everything. He even doubted the parrot, and had views of the intervention of rats and terriers. Persis got rather tired at last of his perverse ingenuity, especially when she had a very shrewd idea herself who had stolen the rubies. When she suggested various doubts, however, which seemed remotely to implicate Sir Justin's honesty, the sensitive American girl felt it go on her nerves, and refused to listen to him, though Mr. Gregory never ceased to enforce upon her, by precept or example, his own pet doctrine that the last person on earth, one, would be likely to suspect is always the one who turns out to have done it. 2 mornings later, Persis looked out her window as she was dressing her hair. She dressed it now herself, though she was an American heiress, and therefore, of course, the laziest of her kind. For she had taken an unaccountable dislike, however, to the quiet girl Bertha. On this particular morning, however, when Persis looked out, she saw Bertha engaged in close and apparently very intimate conversation with a Hampton's postman. This sight disturbed the unstable equilibrium of the equanimity of the little. Why should Bertha go to the door to the postman at all? Surely it was no part of the duty of Lady McClure's maid to take in letters. And why should she want to go prying into the question of who wrote to Miss Remnant? For Persis, intensely conscious herself that a note from Sir Justin lay on top of the postman's bundle, as she recognized it at once, even at that distance below, by the particular shape of the broad, rough envelope, jumped to the natural feminine conclusion that Bertha must needs be influenced by some abstruse motive, which she herself, Paris, was, to say the very least, a component element. 'Tis a human fallacy. We're all of us prone to see everything from a personal standpoint. Indeed, one quality that makes a man or woman into a possible novelist, good, bad, or indifferent, is just that special power of throwing himself or herself into a great many people's personalities alternately. And this is the power possessed on average by not 1 in 1,000 men and not 1 in 10,000 women. Persis rang the bell violently. Bertha came up, all smiles. "Did you want anything, miss?" Persis could have choked her. "Yes," she answered plainly, taking the bull by the horns. "I want to know what you were doing down there, prying into the other people's letters without promotion." Bertha looked at her, ever bland. She answered at once, without a second's hesitation. "The postman's my young man, miss, and we hope before very long to get married." Odious thing, Persis thought. Glib lie always ready on the tip of her tongue for every emergency. But Bertha's full heart was beating rapidly, beating with love and hope and deferred anxiety. A little later in the day, Persis mentioned the incident casually to Lady McClure, mainly in order to satisfy herself that the girl had been lying. Lady McClure, however, gave a qualified assent. "I believe she's engaged to the postman," she said. "I think I've heard so, though I make it a rule, you see, my dear, to know the little as I can of people's love affairs. They're so very uninteresting. But Bertha certainly told me she wouldn't leave me to get married for an indefinite period. That was only 10 days ago. She said her young man wasn't yet in a position to make a home for her." "Perhaps," Persis suggested grimly, "something has occurred meanwhile to better her position. Such strange things crop up. She may have come into a fortune." "Perhaps so," Lady McClure replied languidly. The subject bored her. "Though if so, it must really have been very sudden, for I think it was morning before you lost your jewel. She told me so." Persis thought it that odd, but she made no comment. Before dinner that evening, she burst suddenly into Lady McClure's room for a minute. Bertha was dressing her lady's hair. Friends were coming to dine, among them Sir Justin. "How do these pearls go with my complexion, Lady McClure?" Persis asked rather anxiously, for she especially wished to look her best that evening for someone at the party. "Oh, charming," her hostess answered with a society smile. "Never saw anything suit you better, Persis." "Except for my poor rubies," Persis cried rather ruefully, for colored gewgaws are dear to the savage and the woman. "I wish I could have them back. I wonder if that man Gregory hasn't succeeded in finding them." "Oh, my dear," Lady McClure drawled out, "you may be sure that by this time they're safe in Amsterdam. That's the only place in Europe to go to look for them now." "Why, to Amsterdam, my lady?" Bertha interposed suddenly, with a quick side glance at Persis. Lady McClure threw her head back in a surprise at so unwanted an intrusion. "What do you want to know that for, child?" she asked somewhat curtly. "Why, the cut, of course. All the diamond cutters in the world are concentrated in Amsterdam. And the first thing a thief does when he steals big jewels is to find them across and have them cut into a few new shapes so they won't be identified." "I shouldn't have thought that," Bertha put in calmly. "They'd have known who to send them to." Lady McClure turned to her sharply. "Why, these things," she said, with a calm air of knowledge, "are always done by experienced thieves who know the ropes well and are in league with receivers the whole world over. But Gregory has his eye on one in Amsterdam, I'm sure, and we'll soon hear everything." "Yes, my lady," Bertha answered in her acquiescent tone, and relapsed back into silence. 4 days later, about 9 at night, that hard-working man, the postie on the beat, stood loitering outside Sir Everard McClure's house, openly defying the rules of the department, in close confidence with Bertha. "Well, any news?" Bertha asked, trembling over with excitement, for she was a very different person outside with her lover from the demure and imperturbable model maid who waited on my lady. "Why, yes," the postie answered with a low laugh of triumph. "A letter from Amsterdam. I think we fixed it." Bertha almost flung herself upon him. "Oh, Harry," she cried, all eagerness. "This is too good to be true. Then just 1 other month we can really get married." There was a minute's pause, inarticulately filling up with sounds unrepressible through the art of a typewriter. Then Harry spoke again. "It's an awful lot of money," he said, musing. "A regular fortune. And what's more, Bertha, if you hadn't gone for your cleverness, we should have never got it." Bertha pressed his hand affectionately. Even ladies' maids are human. "Well, if I hadn't been so much in love with you," she answered frankly, "I don't think I would have ever had the wit to manage it. But, oh, Harry, love makes one do anything." If Perseus had heard those singular words, she would have felt no doubt was any longer possible. Next morning, at 10 o'clock, the policeman came round post-haste to Sir Everard's. He asked to see Miss Ramnet. When Persis came down in her morning wrap, he had but a brief message from headquarters to give her. "Your jewels are found, miss. Will you step round and identify them?" Persis drove back with him, all trembling. Lady McClure accompanied her. At the police station, they left their cab and entered the anteroom. A little group had assembled there. The first person Persis distinctly made out as Sir Justin. Great terror seized her. Gregory had so poisoned her mind with his timeless suspicion that everybody and everything she came across that she was afraid of her own shadow. But next moment she saw clearly that he wasn't there as a prisoner or even a witness, merely as a spectator. She acknowledged him with a hasty bow and cast her eyes around again. The next person she was definitely distinguished was Bertha, as calm and cool as ever, but in the very center of the group, occupying, as it were, the place of honor which naturally belongs to the prisoner on all similar occasions. Persis was not surprised at all. She had known it all along. She glanced menacingly at Gregory, who stood a little behind, looking by no means triumphant. Persis found his objection odd, but he was a proud detective, and perhaps someone else had effected the capture. "These are your jewels, I believe," the inspector said, holding them up, and Persis admitted it. "This is a painful case," the inspector went on. "A very painful case. We're grieved to have discovered such a clue against one of our own men. But as he owns it to himself, and intends to throw himself at the mercy of the court, there's no use in talking about it. He won't attempt to defend it. Indeed, with such evidence, I think he's doing what's best and wisest." Bertha stood there all dazed. I don't understand, she cried with a swimming brain. Who on earth are you talking about? The inspector pointedly muted with one hand at Gregory. And then, for the first time, Persis saw he was guarded. He clapped her hand to her head. In a moment, it all broke in upon her. When she called the police, the rubies had never been stolen at all. It was Gregory who had stolen them. She understood it now, at once. The real facts came back to her. She had taken her necklace off at night and laid it carelessly down on the dressing gown, too full for Sir Justin, covered it accidentally with a lace pocket handkerchief, and straightway forgotten all about it. Next day she missed it, and jumped at conclusions. When Gregory came, he spied the rubies askance under the corner of the handkerchief, of course. Being a woman, she had naturally looked everywhere except the place where she had laid them. And knowing that it was a safe case, he had quietly pocketed them before her very eyes, unsuspected. He felt sure nobody would accuse him of robbery, which was committed before he came, and which he had himself been called in to investigate. The worst of it is, the inspector went on, he had just woven a very ingenious case against Sir Justin O'Byrne, whom we were on this very point of arresting today. If this young woman hadn't come down at the 11th hour, just in the nick of time, and earned the reward by giving us a clue that led us to the discovery and recovery of the jewels. They were brought over this morning by an Amsterdam detective. Persis looked hard at Bertha. Bertha answered this look. My young man was a postman, miss, she exclaimed, quite simply, and after what my lady said, I put him up to watch Mr. Gregory's delivery for a letter from Amsterdam. I suspected him at the very first. When the letter came, we had him arrested at once and found out from who the people in Amsterdam had the rubies. Persis gasped in astonishment. Her brain was reeling, but Gregory, in the background, put in one last word. Well, I was all right after all, he said, with professional pride. I told you that the very last person you dreamed of suspecting was sure to be the one who actually did it. Lady O'Byrne's rubies were very much admired at Monte Carlo last season. Mr. Gregory was found in permanent employment for the next 7 years in Her Majesty's quarries on the Isle of Portland. Bertha and her postman have retired to Canada with £500 to buy a farm. And everybody says Sir Justin Byrne has beaten the record after all, even for Irish baronets, for making the marriage at once of money and affection.